The gala of shadows and light, the city of New York that night pulsed with the kind of energy only wealth could afford to trap inside crystal walls. Its streets humming with sleek black cars gliding toward the Whitmore Grand Hotel, where a fundraising gala was unfolding like a perfectly choreographed ballet. Spotlights crossed the skies, camera flashes stitched together a temporary constellation of stars, and the great chandeliers inside spilled golden light over the polished marble floor as though sunlight itself had bent down to flatter the gowns and tuxedos of the powerful. It was a place built for display, where laughter was rehearsed, where hands exchanged greetings like signatures on invisible contracts, and where generosity was spoken of as though it were a perfume rather than an act. Beneath that dazzling illusion, the truth was simple. The rich gathered here not to give, but to be seen giving, and the very air seemed trained to acknowledge only those who carried influence, as if power itself emitted light, while the ones who kept the machine turning remained in the shadows. Marcus Carter had learned the language of those shadows, better than any other tongue. For 5 years he had been the man behind the polished glass, the careful mop, the neatly folded rags stacked in his cart like soldiers waiting for silent orders. To many he was invisible, a passing blur in a navy shirt and black gloves, a shadow that moved only to clear away the champagne glass left at the wrong angle or to erase the smudge on the marble floor before the light could catch it. Invisibility was not weakness, here it was survival, and Marcus knew how to shrink himself until only his labor was visible, not the man performing it. Still, every once in a while, when he crossed near the stage at the far end of the hall, his eyes would linger on the Steinway grand piano placed like a shrine beneath the chandelier. Its glossy black surface mirrored the glow of the golden lights. Its ivory keys gleamed like rows of teeth in a waiting jaw. And though he always turned away quickly, Marcus felt the ache of recognition each time. Once, before the weight of life, and loss bent his shoulders and forced his hands to carry buckets instead of dreams, he had belonged to the world of music. Once, his fingers had pressed down on keys like a man breathing out prayers, and melodies had been his only language. That world had crumbled when his mother passed, when bills outweighed lessons, when reality demanded sacrifice. Yet, even in the silence, music still lingered inside him like an ember buried beneath ashes, waiting for one reckless gust of wind to spark again. The gala unfolded smoothly, the voices of the elite filling the room with practiced charm, their smiles sharp, as blades yet concealed beneath the sheen of expensive teeth and polished manners. Marcus remained at the edges, picking up glasses before they rolled under tables, straightening napkins folded into swans, making sure no candle dripped wax onto the linen that had been ironed twice that afternoon. A woman in diamonds brushed past him without meeting his eyes, murmuring only a dismissive "excuse me," though she had already stepped on his foot. A man held out his car keys as though Marcus were valet, then scoffed when Marcus explained he was maintenance staff. Each slight was small, casual, and forgettable for them, but for Marcus, the weight of such dismissals layered like dust over the years. Still, he smiled politely, nodded quietly, and kept moving because in this world there was no space for his protest. Among the glittering guests, one figure commanded the most light: Valeria Kingsley, heir to the Kingsley Empire, her fortune built from steel, finance, and old money layered across generations. She wore her power like a crimson silk gown, heavy yet effortless, a flame cutting through the room. Her every gesture followed by cameras and whispered praise. Valeria was beautiful in the way statues were beautiful, cold, distant, perfect, in form but impossible to touch. She smiled with precision, each angle calculated, her laughter polished for effect, her gaze sweeping past people like a queen appraising pawns. To the public, she was the epitome of elegance, but those who served beneath her saw another face, the quick sting of her temper, the disdain that slipped when cameras turned away, the conviction that her place above others was not just money, but destiny. It was near the height of the evening, after speeches of hope and charity were delivered like lines from a well-practiced play, when Marcus stepped too close to the current of her orbit. A tray of glasses rolled under the table near where Valeria posed for photos, and Marcus bent to retrieve one. He rose just as Valeria turned, her hand flicking outward with a champagne glass, and the liquid splashed across her red gown in a golden streak. The crowd gasped, then hushed, the moment rippling outward until all eyes settled on the dark-skinned janitor standing too close to a woman worth billions. Valeria's voice cut the silence like glass. "What have you done?" she snapped, her tone a lash meant to draw blood. Marcus straightened slowly, the glass in his hand steady, his face calm despite the sting of humiliation pressing against his chest. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said evenly, his voice low but respectful. "I didn't mean," she cut him off, shaking her head with disdain. "You stained this dress. Do you have the slightest idea how much it costs?" The question wasn't meant to be answered. It was a blade to carve the gap between them. Around them, laughter slipped out, first as nervous chuckles, then as sharper notes of mockery. A businessman nearby whispered something about people sticking to their place, and a group of young guests smirked at the unspoken undertone. To them, Marcus was not a man, only an accident in motion, an invisible servant who had dared to step to. Near the frame of the powerful, Marcus kept his composure, though the laughter pressed against him like walls closing in. "I'll cover the cleaning cost," he said, though he knew a single invoice from her boutique would crush his monthly wages. His words were paper shields against a storm. Valeria, weary from weeks of investor demands and press scrutiny, let her irritation sharpen into cruelty. She needed control, and humiliation was her chosen weapon. She smiled suddenly, her eyes glittering with something cold. "How about this?" she said loudly, ensuring the room heard. "If you can sit at that piano and play better than a professional, I'll marry you." The room burst into laughter, the kind meant to disguise cruelty as entertainment. Someone joked about too many white keys for him. Others clapped at the audacity, and phones were lifted higher, eager to capture a spectacle. To them, this was harmless fun, a dare wrapped in arrogance. For Valeria, it was a way to reassert dominance, to turn embarrassment into a performance where she would always control the narrative. Marcus could have stepped back, could have bowed his head and vanished into the shadows as always. That was the role expected of him, to absorb insult, to shrink until forgotten. But something in him shifted that night. Perhaps it was the years of invisibility layered on his skin, or perhaps it was the piano itself, gleaming under the chandelier like. A door left ajar into the past he had buried. For the first time in years, Marcus felt the ember stir, the faint but undeniable insistence that dignity mattered more than silence. He met Valeria's eyes without flinching, his voice steady and clear. "I don't need you to marry me," he said, and though his tone was calm, it rolled through the hall with unexpected weight. "But if I do it, I want you to keep your word in front of everyone here." A murmur spread through the crowd, half disbelief, half amusement, yet something quieter to curiosity. Valeria arched a brow, amused by his audacity, convinced the stage still belonged to her. "Perfect," she said, her smile curling like a blade. "Then show us, janitor. The piano is waiting." Phones rose higher, bets exchanged hands, laughter sharpened like knives. Yet in the midst of that glittering cruelty, Marcus folded his gloves neatly onto his tray, set it aside, and walked toward the piano not as a shadow, but as a man stepping back into the light dot. And for the first time that night, the room held its breath. The sound of forgotten hands. Marcus stood before the grand Steinway as if it were not a piano but a mirror into the life he had left behind. The chandelier light spilled across its polished lid, making it glow as though the instrument itself were aware of the moment. Around him, the crowd was restless, laughing, whispering, pressing their phones higher as if hungry for a spectacle. They expected failure. They were ready to feast on embarrassment. A janitor touching the keys of a piano belonged in the same category as a child trying on a crownet was a costume too large, doomed to collapse under its own weight. But Marcus felt none of their laughter. His heartbeat was steady, his breath measured, and as he lowered himself onto the bench, his mind drifted somewhere far from the glittering hall. He remembered the tiny apartment in Harlem where music had once been the only light. His mother, Evelyn, had been a schoolteacher with little money but a heart that believed music was not just sound, but survival. She had saved for years to buy a second-hand upright piano that leaned against the peeling wall like a sentinel of hope. Marcus had been 5 when she first sat him on the bench, guiding his small fingers over the ivory keys. "Don't count them, baby," she whispered. "Don't fear them, just feel the music." By 12, Marcus was playing Chopin and Gershwin with a fire that made neighbors stop in the hallway to listen. Teachers had told Evelyn her son was a prodigy, destined for Juilliard if the right doors opened. But doors have locks, and locks require keys carved from money, privilege, and opportunity. When Evelyn fell sick, the piano lessons ended. When she died, the upright piano was sold to pay rent, and Marcus's fingers were left to stiffen against broom handles and mops instead of ivory keys. Yet the music never left him. It lingered in his bones, waiting for a night like this, when humiliation would dare him to remember who he really was. The hall grew quieter as Marcus adjusted the bench, his hands hovering above the keys, but not yet pressing down. Even laughter shrank into nervous murmurs, as though the weight of anticipation had unexpectedly settled on everyone's shoulders. Valeria Kingsley leaned back against the front row seat, her chin lifted, her red silk gown gleaming, her smile fixed in practiced amusement. In her mind, this would end quickly. A clumsy attempt, a wrong note, an awkward silence. Then she would laugh, the crowd would laugh with her, and she would remain untouchable. But a flicker of doubt crossed her face when Marcus spoke, his voice low but steady. "Before I play," he said, "I want one thing made clear. I don't want your money. I don't want your hand. I only want your word. You said you'd keep it, and I intend to hold you to it." For a moment, silence gripped the hall. Then Valeria gave a small, dismissive nod, her diamond earrings swaying. "You have my word," she said, her voice smooth but sharp. "Now show us." Marcus inhaled deeply, letting the breath settle his body. His fingertips touched the keys, soft and deliberate, as though reacquainting themselves with an old friend. The first note emerged, not with flourish, but with restraint clean. resonant sound that hung in the air like a drop of water rippling across still glass. The crowd shifted, murmurs fading. Then came the second note, the third, and slowly the melody of summertime began to bloom, each phrase stretched slightly slower than tradition, giving space for silence to weave itself into the music. His left hand laid a foundation steady, as footsteps on a summer sidewalk, while his right hand painted the air with gentle strokes, each note a brush dipped in memory. He was not playing to impress, he was playing to speak. The audience leaned in without realizing. Phones still hovered, but some hands trembled as the clarity of the music vibrated through marble and bone. David Chen, the music critic, seated nearby, leaned forward, his trained ear catching details the crowd could not name. The way Marcus balanced restraint with resonance, the way he let the pedal breathe instead of blur, the way his phrasing revealed not just technical skill but lived experience. These were the signs of someone who had not only learned music, but carried it as a language of survival. Beautiful touch, Chen murmured under his breath, warm tone. This is no accident. In the second row, the young man who had mocked Marcus earlier froze with his champagne glass half raised. The joke about too many white keys collapsed in his throat as the music stripped away the protective shield of laughter. Across the hall, a woman who had been recording with her phone slowly lowered it, placing it face down on the table, as though unwilling to risk contaminating the moment with digital noise. The ripple was subtle but unstoppable. The room that had gathered for spectacle was now held captive by sincerity. Marcus closed his eyes as he played, letting the hall dissolve around him. He was back in Harlem, his mother's hand guiding his wrist, her voice urging him to feel rather than force. He was a boy again, sitting at the upright piano in a room that smelled of books and laundry detergent, hearing the sound of hope rising out of poverty. Each note he played now was not for the crowd, not for Valeria, not even for himself. It was for Evelyn Carter, whose love had given him a language even the world's cruelty could not erase. The melody swelled, dipped, rose again, and for a moment, time itself seemed to pause. By the time the piece ended, the hall was silent. No laughter, no murmurs, no applause, yet tonally silence so profound it seemed the building itself was listening. Then, as the final note dissolved into the marble, someone in the back whispered, "My God." The whisper triggered a wave, soft at first, then stronger. Applause broke out, hesitant but genuine, swelling until it filled the room like thunder, rolling across a summer sky. Valeria's smile had frozen, her carefully crafted expression cracking at the edges. She had expected embarrassment, not brilliance. She had expected mockery, not reverence, and for the first time in her life, she realized she was no longer controlling the narrative. The room had shifted, and Marcus Carter, the janitor she had mocked, was now the center of gravity. Marcus stood slowly, his face calm, his hands resting on the closed lid of the piano. He didn't bow, didn't smile, didn't perform gratitude for approval. He simply stood as a man who had spoken in the only language he trusted. Then he turned to Valeria, his voice steady but sharp enough to cut through the thunder of applause. "Your word," he said, reminding her, anchoring her to the promise she thought was a joke. The hall waited, breathless, their applause fading into anticipation again. Valeria's chest tightened as she realized every eye, every camera, every witness now waited for her response. For perhaps the first time, the power she wielded so easily was not hers to command it, belonged to the truth of the moment. And Marcus had forced her into its light. The ripples of truth or applause that filled the hall that night did not end when the music stopped. It lingered in the very walls of the Whitmore Grand Hotel, as if even the marble had been etched with the sound of transformation. Guests who had come expecting only an evening of glitter and empty speeches now found themselves whispering about something that had no price tag, raw talent, and undeniable dignity. The crowd, trained to cheer for status and wealth, discovered, their voices rising for a janitor who had done the unthinkable. He had silenced arrogance with beauty, humiliation with truth. Marcus Carter, who had spent 5 years making himself invisible so others could shine, now stood like a beacon, and no one could look away. Valeria Kingsley, whose laughter had once dictated the rhythm of every room she entered, sat stiff in her seat, her red gown gleaming under the chandelier, yet unable to shield her from the weight of her own words. She had made the dare to humiliate him, to reclaim control after the splash of champagne had embarrassed her in front of her peers. But now the tables had turned. Every guest, every camera, every eye in the hall had become a witness not to his failure, but to her arrogance. When Marcus turned to her and calmly said, "Your word," it was not only a reminder of the reckless promise she had made, but an indictment of the very culture she embodied, the belief that words spoken in power carried no consequence. The room waited. Some smirked behind their glasses, eager to see how the billionaire would wriggle free. Others looked on with rare seriousness, sensing that something more than entertainment had just happened, something that demanded accountability. Valeria, for the first time in years, felt her chest tighten with the unfamiliar sensation of being cornered by truth. She forced a smile, her voice smooth yet brittle. "Of course," she said, though the words caught slightly in her throat. "A promise is a promise." Phones captured the moment, flashes strobing across the room, live streams sending her words across social media before she could reshape them. By the time the gala ended, the clip had already begun its viral spread. The billionaire's mocking dare, the janitor's astonishing performance, and her reluctant acknowledgement that she would keep her word. The story left the glittering walls of the Whitmore and spilled into the streets of New York, then into the feeds of millions, each share and repost layering new meaning onto the night. The next morning, headlines stretched across digital banners, and morning shows. Janitor shocks elite gala with piano performance. Billionaire's mocking dare backfires. Marcus Carter, the hidden genius. The video clip, less than 3 minutes long, had already amassed millions of views. Viewers debated not only his music, but the cruelty of the dare, the casual arrogance of wealth. The way a man dismissed as invisible had forced the powerful to listen. Strangers across the world commented, "This brought me to tears. Talent can't be hidden forever." She tried to humiliate him, but he reminded us all of dignity. For Marcus, who had returned to his modest apartment in Harlem with sore feet and the familiar scent of cleaning chemicals still clinging to his clothes, the sudden attention felt surreal. His phone buzzed endlessly with calls from numbers he didn't recognize, messages flooding his voicemail. Neighbors knocked on his door, some with tears in their eyes, others with excitement spilling out of them. "Marcus, we saw you. That was you on the piano." A group of children who lived down the block ran up to him, their eyes wide with awe, asking if he could teach them. For years, Marcus had moved through life unnoticed, his dignity carried quietly within, but now the world had turned its gaze upon him, and he did not know if he wanted it. At the hotel, whispers of the night refused to fade. Staff who had always kept their heads down walked a little taller. pride flickering in their eyes as they remembered the janitor who had reminded the world that worth was not tied to a uniform. Gloria Johnson, the veteran housekeeper who had slipped Marcus tissues during breaks, told anyone who asked he was always more than this job. Always. The other staff nodded in agreement, as if his music had validated their own quiet resilience. Valeria, meanwhile, found herself facing a storm she had never calculated for. Her PR team worked overtime, drafting statements, spinning narratives, but the internet was not kind to arrogance. Comment sections were filled with anger at her words, dissecting the casual cruelty of her dare, turning her into a symbol of the elite's disregard for humanity. Investors called with concerns, journalists demanded interviews, and even friends who had once laughed at her sharp wit now distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with the scandal. For the first time, Valeria realized that money and influence could not erase the memory of truth spoken in front of witnesses. Marcus tried to retreat into silence, to return to the comfort of invisibility, but the world would not let him. Invitations arrived daily. Churches asked him to play for Sunday services. Universities offered him honorary performances. Television networks requested appearances. He turned most of them down, not out of pride, but because the stage had never been his pursuit. Music was not performance, to him it was remembrance, it was survival. It was his mother's voice, lingering in his fingertips. Yet slowly, he began to see that what had once been only his language might now serve as a lantern for others stumbling in the dark. One evening, as he walked home from work, he saw a young boy sitting on the curb with a cracked keyboard on his lap, plunking out broken notes. The boy looked up with wide eyes and whispered, "Mister, I saw you on the phone. You play like magic." Marcus knelt beside him, pressing one key gently, then another, showing him how to let the sound breathe. In that moment, Marcus understood something he had not realized at the gala, that his gift was not only his own, it was a seed meant to be planted in others. Meanwhile, Valeria wrestled with herself in silence. Alone in her penthouse, stripped of the flattering lights and applause, she replayed the video again and again. She heard her own mocking tone, the laughter of her peers, and then the music so pure it exposed the hollowness of her power. For the first time, she questioned whether the empire she had inherited had given her strength, or whether it had stolen her humanity. Pride told her to double down, to fight the narrative, to crush Marcus with legal threats, or dismiss him as a fluke. But another voice, faint and unwelcome, whispered a truth she had long buried, that perhaps she had more to learn from the janitor than he from her. By the end of that week, Marcus Carter was no longer invisible. He was a symbol. A man who had walked into the light not to claim wealth or fame, but to remind the world that dignity was not for sale. And though he tried to shrink back into his quiet life, the ripples of his truth were spreading farther than he could control. And somewhere, watching him from a distance, Valeria Kingsley began to wonder whether keeping her word meant more than surviving a scandal, whether it meant finally facing the emptiness she had built her life upon. The choice between pride and humanity the weeks following the gala turned into a storm of attention Marcus never asked for, a storm he tried to resist but could not escape. What had been a single night inside a glittering ballroom spread into living rooms across the country, and then further into the global conversation. His face, once unnoticed even in the hallways of the hotel, appeared on magazine covers and news features. He became the symbol of dignity discovered in the most unlikely of places. The story every news anchor retold with reverence. A janitor with the heart of a genius silenced the arrogance of the powerful with nothing but music. Yet to Marcus, the whirlwind felt less like recognition and more like disruption. He still rose before dawn to put on his navy shirt, still polished floors that would never remember his reflection, still walked streets where most people did not know his name. But every time he stepped outside, strangers stopped him, their faces full of awe, pressing his hand, telling him how his music had made them cry or reminded them of a dream they had buried. Mothers asked him to play at schools, young students begged him for lessons, and pastors from Harlem churches pleaded for him to bring his gift to their congregations. At first, Marcus refused them all. He told himself that he was not a performer, not a prophet, not a man built for a stage. Music, to him, was never spectacle. It was memory, it was prayer, it was survival stitched into sound. To parade it before crowds felt wrong, as though he would be selling a piece of himself he could never buy back. Yet every time he heard a child hum the melody he had played that night, every time an elder clasped his shoulder and said, "Son, you gave us back hope," he began to feel the quiet pull of responsibility. Perhaps his gift was not just his own. Perhaps it was meant to be shared, even if it cost him his comfort. Meanwhile, Valeria Kingsley found herself in unfamiliar territory. For years she had been untouchable, every scandal smoothed away by wealth, every criticism drowned beneath lawyers and publicists. But this time was different. The internet did not forget, and the video of her mocking dare had become a permanent wound to her reputation. Investors called with hesitation in their voices. Board members pressed for explanations, and protesters even gathered outside Kingsley Tower with signs that read, "Respect is not for sale and words carry weight." Her PR team urged her to apologize, to issue a carefully crafted statement of regret. But Valeria resisted. Apologies, she believed, were admissions of weakness, and weakness was something she had trained herself never to show. Instead, she doubled down on appearances, attending galas with her chin higher than before, her red lips painted into a smile so sharp it cut through questions. But in the quiet hours of the night, when the city lights outside her penthouse faded into silence, she could no longer silence the memory of Marcus's music. It haunted her, threading its way into the emptiness she had mistaken for strength, forcing her to ask questions she had long buried beneath her fortune. Their paths crossed again, not in the glittering halls of the Whitmore, but in a modest community center in Harlem where Marcus had finally agreed to play. The room was small, the walls painted with murals of children running free, the ceiling lined with fluorescent lights that hummed quietly. Folding chairs were arranged in rows, filled not with billionaires in silk gowns, but with neighbors, families, teachers, and students, all gathered because they had seen something in Marcus's music that reminded them of themselves. Marcus sat at an upright piano much like the one his mother had once owned, his hands moving with the same humility as before, each note weaving warmth into the air. The applause was not thunderous, not polished, but it was real, rising from hearts untrained in performance, but rich in gratitude. It was there that Valeria entered, her presence causing whispers to ripple through the crowd. She wore no red gown tonight, only a simple black coat, yet even stripped of her armor, she carried the weight of her reputation. Marcus saw her as he rose from the piano, his calm eyes steady, not surprised but not welcoming either. The room seemed tense, aware of the clash between the woman who had mocked and the man who had answered with dignity. Valeria stepped forward, her voice low but carrying across the chairs. "I came because I owe you something," she said, her usual polish replaced by something raw, something uncertain. Marcus studied her for a long moment before speaking. "You came because people are watching," he replied, his tone even, not cruel but unflinching. "But the question is, what will you do when no one is?" The silence that followed cut deeper than any headline. Valeria, who had mastered boardrooms and controlled press conferences, found herself disarmed by a janitor who spoke truth without raising his voice. For the first time, she realized that her power was fragile, built not on respect but on fear and spectacle, and Marcus had exposed it with nothing more than music and honesty. She wanted to retort, to reclaim control, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she lowered her gaze briefly, a gesture so small it might have gone unnoticed but for Valeria. It was the beginning of something she had never allowed herself before: humility. Over the following days, their confrontation became another story for the public to devour. Articles debated whether Valeria's visit to the community center was genuine or calculated, whether Marcus's refusal to flatter her was a rejection or a lesson. But beyond the noise, something quieter began to take root. Marcus continued to play in small venues, churches, schools, neighborhoods forgotten by power, his music giving hope where it was needed most. And Valeria, stripped of her invulnerability, found herself returning to those spaces, not as a queen among pawns, but as a woman learning what it meant to listen. In those encounters, the tension between them grew more complex. He represented truth she had spent her life avoiding. She represented a world that had crushed him into invisibility. Yet beneath their differences, an unspoken recognition formed that perhaps both of them were being reshaped by forces larger than themselves. Pride and humanity wrestled within them, and though neither would admit it aloud, each knew that their story was not finished, that the choice between who they had been and who they could become was still unfolding. One note, one word, one step at a time. The final performance. By the time the winter winds swept through New York, Marcus Carter was no longer just the man who had once cleaned the floors of the Whitmore Grand Hotel. He had become a symbol carried in the hearts of millions. Across the city, children hummed the melody he had played that night. Families gathered to watch the viral clip that still moved them to tears. And strangers who had never met him spoke of his name with the same reverence usually reserved for saints or poets. Yet Marcus himself remained the same man who rose before dawn to put on his worn navy shirt, who stopped in grocery stores to help an elder lift a bag, who still visited the quiet grave of his mother to leave fresh flowers. Fame had brushed against him, but it had not taken root in him. He belonged not to the stage, but to the soil of ordinary life. Still, the world demanded one final performance. Invitations poured in from around the globe, from grand concert halls in Paris to televised events in Los Angeles, but Marcus ignored most of them. He did not want to play for power again, not in the gilded cages where music was treated as decoration. But when a coalition of charities proposed a global broadcast to raise funds for schools, hospitals, and neighborhoods like the one he had grown up in, Marcus agreed. This, he thought, was something his mother would have wanted to let music not just impress. But the night of the performance was unlike anything Marcus had ever known. The venue was the Metropolitan Opera House, its vast stage stretching before an audience not just of thousands in person, but millions watching across screens worldwide. The chandeliers glittered overhead, but unlike the gala, the air was different, less suffocating, less cruel. Here, the room was not waiting to mock or measure him. It was waiting to listen. And waiting, too, was Valeria Kingsley, seated in the front row once again, though this time without a gown blazing like fire. She wore simple black, her hair tied back, her face bare of its usual armor of perfection. Her presence was not a command, but a reckoning. When Marcus stepped onto the stage, the hall erupted in applause. But he lifted a hand gently, asking for silence, and the room obeyed. He sat at the Steinway, his body steady, his eyes closing for a brief moment as if reaching into memory. Then he began to play, not a showpiece, not something chosen to impress critics, but a composition of his own, a weaving of every fragment of his life into sound. His music carried the echo of Harlem nights, the whisper of his mother's voice, the sorrow of invisible years, and the triumph of a dignity reclaimed. It rose and fell like tides, sometimes fierce, sometimes tender, until the air itself seemed transformed into light. The audience wept openly. Strangers held hands. Children leaned against their parents' shoulders, their eyes wide with wonder. And in the front row, Valeria Kingsley felt her chest break open under the weight of the music. She had spent her life building walls of marble and steel, armoring herself in wealth and arrogance. But here, under the flood of Marcus's truth, she found no defense. The notes exposed her hollowness, stripped away her pride, and reminded her of the humanity she had long buried. For the first time, tears rolled down her face, not as a performance, but as surrender. When the final note lingered and dissolved into silence, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then the hall erupted, not in polite applause, not in the shallow thunder of performance, but in a roar that felt like the voice of humanity itself. People stood, clapping until their palms ached, shouting his name, crying out their gratitude. Marcus stood slowly, bowed once with humility, and then turned to the microphone. His voice, calm and steady, carried more power than the roar of applause. Music is not about who you are to the world, he said. It is about who you are when no one is watching. It is about the truth you carry inside, the truth that cannot be erased by poverty or power. I was a janitor. I still am a janitor. But I am also a son who learned from his mother that dignity is the only thing we cannot afford to lose. Tonight, I play not for myself, but for every person who has ever been told they are invisible. You are not, you never were. The hall thundered again, but this time it was not applause, it was a standing affirmation, a wave of humanity rising together. Cameras captured every second, broadcasting it to millions. But for Marcus, it was not about the world. It was about the quiet grave where Evelyn Carter rested, about the little boy on the Harlem curb with the cracked keyboard, about the countless unseen who now knew they were seen. And then came the moment everyone waited for. Valeria rose from her seat, the hot tea, cameras instantly turning to her, their lenses hungry for scandal or redemption. She walked to the stage slowly, her head bowed, her hands trembling. When she reached Marcus, she lifted the microphone, her voice breaking. I mocked you. I humiliated you. I thought my power made me untouchable, but tonight I see that it is you who holds what I never had: truth, humanity, and the courage to live without armor. I cannot undo what I said that night, but I can keep my word. You asked me to remember every word I spoke, and I do. So, before the world, I say this: I will keep my promise, not by binding you to me, but by binding myself to the truth you showed me. From this day, My wealth will serve the people it has ignored. My power will be used to lift, not to crush. And my name will not stand for arrogance, but for accountability. The crowd gasped, some skeptical, some moved. But Marcus, who had no need for her wealth or her penance, simply nodded. Then keep your word, he said softly. Not for me, for them. He gestured to the crowd, to the cameras, to the unseen millions watching Dot from that night forward. Valeria Kingsley's empire began to change, slowly, imperfectly, but undeniably. Schools were funded, hospitals rebuilt, communities supported, not as charity, but as restitution. And Marcus Carter, though he was offered stages and fortunes, returned often to Harlem, teaching children, playing in small churches, reminding the world that greatness was not measured by applause, but by the lives touched in silence. The gala at the Whitmore Grand faded into history, but its lesson burned brighter with time, that words carry weight, that dignity cannot be erased, and that sometimes the smallest voice can silence the arrogance of an empire. And in the quiet of his apartment, after the noise of the world had dimmed, Marcus would sometimes sit at an old upright piano, much like the one his mother once owned, playing softly into the night. He played not for the cameras, not for applause, but for Evelyn Carter, who had once told a small boy, "Don't count the keys, baby, just feel the music." And he did.